New York, September 11th, 2018. High up in the skies, Air India 101 is approaching John F. Kennedy International Airport for a second attempt to land. This plane has just suffered multiple sensitive instrument failures. After a 14-hour flight, they are running low on fuel. They've also lost the ILS, the device that helps the pilots land the plane, especially in poor weather. Outside the cockpit, it's raining heavily. With clouds all around them, the pilots are flying blind, and it's next to impossible to spot the runway. With every passing minute, they are using up more fuel, and they have to land now. The lives of 357 people on board now depends on what the pilots do in the next few minutes. Were they able to avoid another tragedy on September 11th in New York? Let's find out. This is the story of Air India Flight 101. It's a warm autumn night in New Delhi's Indira Gandhi International Airport. 342 passengers and 15 crew were preparing for their 14-hour-long flight to New York. The US is a popular destination for Indian students and tourists, and the plane was at maximum capacity. This flight from Delhi's IGI to New York's JFK is Air India's flagship route. This flight would take the passengers over the polar route, flying over the rugged terrain of Pakistan, Russia, Finland, Greenland, and Canada before entering the USA. The plane for today's flight was a Boeing 777-300 extended range twin jet. It's fitted with two GE90-115B engines. This plane was first delivered to Air India in 2009, and it has been in operation for over 9 years. The 777 can be flown by two pilots. But because this flight was 15 hours long and needed to cover around 12,000 kilometers, AI-101 had four pilots. Two served as the main crew, and the other two as the relief crew. The commander was Captain Rustam Palia, a 49-year-old with 3,500 hours on the type. With him in the cockpit were Captain Vikas, Captain Shishant Singh, and Captain D.S. Bhatti. It's the first time the four of them were flying together. During the pre-flight briefing, the engineering staff reported that the flight's auxiliary power unit, the APU, was not functioning. The APU on an aircraft like the Boeing 777ER is not typically considered critical for the safe operation of the aircraft. While the APU provides auxiliary power for various aircraft systems when the main engines are not running, it is not a primary propulsion system. Hence, the pilots agreed that this issue was non-critical and elected to proceed with their flight to New York. With the possibility of inclement weather in the forecast, the captain opted to onload an additional 800 kilos of fuel to take them to an alternate airport if required. This decision would end up being crucial. The crew then asked for pushback and taxi clearance, and the plane then departed Delhi at 0300 local time, delayed by around 1 hour. The departure itself was uneventful. The first signs of problems occurred 40 minutes into the flight. Whilst over Pakistani airspace, and just after reaching 30,000 feet, a warning message appeared on the pilot's screen saying, "Single source radio altimeter." A radio altimeter is like a magic ruler for airplanes that tells them how high they are above the ground. It does this by sending invisible waves down to the ground and timing how long it takes for them to come back. This helps pilots land safely and fly at the right altitude. The Boeing 777, like many modern commercial aircraft, includes 3 radio altimeters for redundancy and safety. They do it so that if one radio altimeter fails, the aircraft can rely on the other 2 altimeters to provide accurate altitude information. But what this plane was telling the pilots was that 2 radio altimeters had failed and only one was working. The problem was, how can you be sure that the one altimeter that is working is actually showing the correct height? Now, this isn't an issue in cruise flight because during cruise, a different type of altimeter called the barometric altimeter is used. The barometric altimeter uses the air pressure to determine how high they are above sea level. It operates based on the principle that atmospheric pressure decreases with increasing altitude. But this is less accurate than the radio altimeter. Radio altimeter becomes very important when accurate height informations are critical, like during departure and more importantly, during landing. Keep this in mind for now. We'll come back to it soon. Fast forward 10 hours, and the flight is now flying across the Atlantic Ocean. And this is where the second issue appeared. There was another 3 hours to go before it was time to land in New York. The pilots got a warning that their TCAS system was not working. TCAS, the Traffic Collision Avoidance System, is like a smart traffic cop for airplanes. It uses radar to see other planes in the sky, and if two planes got too close, it tells the pilots of each of the planes to either go up or go down to avoid a collision.
Clear of conflict.
It helps keep the skies safe by preventing planes from bumping into each other. The loss of the TCAS itself was again not a major concern because during cruise, it was a backup system to prevent collisions. However, it's a handy wingman during takeoff and landing when you're usually flying in a crowded airspace and your workload is very high. Now, this started to concern the crew because it's usually uncommon for unrelated instruments to stop working. The APU was not working prior to takeoff, the radio altimeters failed just after takeoff, and now the TCAS had also failed. What they were concerned was whether there was an unknown issue with the plane that was causing all these failures to happen. But there was nothing much they could do now, so they pushed on to New York. It's now around 10 minutes past 6 in the morning in New York. The weather was overcast with rain and clouds. The METAR indicated a visibility of quarter statute mile for runway 04 right and a vertical visibility of 200 feet. AI-101 entered the New York airspace and made contact with the approach controller.
Good morning, Air India 101, final 4 right.
Air India 101, heading Kennedy Tower, good morning, you're following an Embraer toward final, wind 040 at 4, RVR 3000, runway 4 right, clear to land.
4 right, clear to land, Air India 1.
After obtaining their approach clearance for runway 4 right at JFK, the pilots attempted to use their ILS to capture the localizer and the glide slope to guide them towards the runway. However, try as they may, the ILS just wasn't capturing the localizer signals. Their instrument landing system had also failed. The ILS is super helpful for planes when they are landing. It uses special radio signals and antennas on the runway to guide the plane down safely, showing the pilots where to go and how high they are. It's like following invisible lines in the sky to make sure the plane lands smoothly, especially in bad weather. This is also the device that enables the plane to auto-land. In this plane, the ILS wasn't locking onto the signals being sent from the runway. The crew then manually pointed the plane at the correct heading and then tried what's called a LNAV-VNAV approach. LNAV-VNAV approach uses GPS, similar to what you have in your cars, to take the airplane close to the runway. However, unlike the ILS, the LNAV-VNAV isn't precise and has a lateral precision of 0.3 nautical miles. Hence, the pilots need to be able to visually see the runway at their decision altitude before they land. If they aren't able to see the runway at their minimas, they'll need to go around and try again. As they were closing towards the runway, the pilots extended the landing gear, and immediately another warning sound started to go off in the cockpit. This warning was telling the pilots that the landing gear was not fully down and that immediate action needed to be taken. Upon hearing this sound, the pilots are trained to act instinctively to check and solve the issue. And then, after going through the checklist, found that the gear was indeed down and that it was a false alarm. For the pilots who were already experiencing heavy workload, this was a significant distraction. At this point in time, the plane was covering 3 to 4 miles a minute. With all the instrument failures and the incorrect gear warnings, the pilots weren't able to stabilize the aircraft for landing, and hence decided to go around and try again.
Air India 101 going around runway 4, right.
Air India 101 Heavy, roger, fly runway heading, climb and maintain 2000.
Runway heading 2000, Air India 101.
The aircraft climbed back to 2,000 feet, and the pilots then got in touch with New York's departure controller.
Air India 101 having contact, runway 4 right, maintaining 2000, heading 10.
Air India 101 Heavy, thank you. You're at contact. Turn right heading 180, 3011.
The crew then informed the ATC that they required longer holding vectors to try to solve the problems that they were having, and that they were not ready for a second attempt to land just yet.
And Air India 101, could we have longer vectors? We were facing some
Was that the reason for the
it's because we lost the localizer and minima change and velocity issues as well. So we just stopped the
Now, to understand what happens next, you'll need to understand what a cloud ceiling is. A cloud ceiling is the height at which the lowest part of the clouds are above the ground. It tells the pilots at what height above the ground can they start seeing the ground. If the plane had a working ILS and the ability to auto-land, the pilots can land the plane at a cloud ceiling of 0 feet. However, since these pilots were doing a non-precision approach, they need to visually see the runway to ensure that they're landing at the right place. And for that, they required a minimum ceiling of 600 feet. JFK Airport had a ceiling of 200 feet. Their alternate airports of Newark and Stewart were also at 200 feet.
Right now, the sir that I have is showing indefinite ceiling 200 at Kennedy. RVR is 4,500, so that's gotten a little bit better.
The visibility is fine, but the problem we are facing is because with the ILS with a ceiling of 200, because if that to do that.
Okay, so you cannot do like an auto land or something.
No, Autoland is not available because both we've got two radio altimeter failures. So we are one radio altimeter, we've got failures, we've got all multiple failures.
So what ceiling do you need?
Anything about like 100 or so.
I got it. Okay, I understand. Try heading 220. Let me find some other, pull some other up, and let me find something. Okay.
The other issue that the pilots were having was that they wanted to conserve any remaining fuel to allow them to carry out multiple go-arounds if they so had to do them. This meant that they had to land at an airport near the New York area and couldn't fly further out to Boston or Washington to land there.
And just before I go, what's your potential alternate?
The pre-alternate was no. The alternate is Stewart, but both
They were depleting their fuel and were beginning to use their reserves. The additional 800 kilos that they had loaded in Delhi was now proving to be helpful.
Air India 101 Heavy, I'm having trouble finding anything that's really that good. I have Albany is 600 feet overcast, and Boston, Logan would be 500 overcast. What I'm trying to find, Washington Dulles is at 200 feet also.
But just Boston as well, because we're getting a little low on the fuel as well, so we need to ride quick. And one shot.
Higher, we can burn a little less fuel, and then I believe Pittsburgh is 2,500.
That's we have.
Air India 102, 101 Heavy, climb maintain 6,000. Air India 101 Heavy, based on the window that we have in the air at base 4, Bradley, Kilo Bravo Delta Lima will be your top. Okay, so right now the ceiling at there is 500 over.
Got a showing the JSK is also improving. Good try of approach. That
And I'm showing Newark just had a special, and they're showing 400 overcast. They just had a special at 1205 Zulu, so about 6 minutes ago.
okay, so it's better now in Noah. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. The weather came up to 400 feet overcast at Newark.
The departure controller then told the pilots of a new special METAR that was released by Newark that showed that the ceiling had lifted to 400 feet. The pilots decided to attempt to land at Newark with a 400 feet ceiling. Remember, this is still lower than the 600 feet that they'd initially wanted, so they were still not out of the woods.
Do you want to do the VNAT into Newark?
That's right. The only option that we have was, island is unpredictable. So every time we turn towards the localizer, it's
So your ILS is out of service on both the airplane, right?
that's
And then you said also the radar altimeters are out on both the airplane?
we are on a single radio altimeter now.
At this point, the plane had just around 7,200 kilograms of fuel left. Just enough to complete the trip.
You wondering, other than both ILSs, both radar altimeters, what other things failed on the airplane?
Two source radio altimeter. We've got TCAS failure, no auto land, windshield system, auto speed brake.
And in a grim reminder to the pilots of how precarious their position was, the controller asked them,
Randy, you want one? So just when you get a chance, give me the people on board and the fuel on board, please.
We have total of 370 and fuel 2,200 kg.
The pilots were then handed off to the Newark approach controller, who cleared them for the 4 right approach.
101 heavy, 210 miles from Dune, turn right heading 010, maintain 3,000. That's all set. The localizer cleared. Let's wait for it.
The controller then scrambled the emergency vehicles in case assistance was required once the plane landed.
101 heavy, emergency personnel will be standing by.
Sure, Indonesia.
Truck 1, while we wait here, nature of emergency is a computer failure. Aircraft type is a Boeing 777 whiskey model. 270 souls on board and 72,000 kilos of fuel.
Now, at this time, the crew had been flying for over 14 hours in a high-stress environment, trying to land a massive, fully loaded airplane in one of the busiest air corridors in the world without all their usual instruments. And to add to that, when they saw outside the cockpit, all they saw was clouds. And with each passing minute, the pilots were hoping that the clouds would lift and that they would see the runway below. As the plane kept descending, and when it passed 1,000 feet, the plane was higher than what their ideal descent path required. And if this wasn't immediately corrected, the plane would have to go around a second time and use more fuel, which they didn't have. Captain Palia corrected this by pushing the plane's nose down to get back to the ideal path. But this caused the plane to speed up further. And at one point, the controller saw a warning on their screen indicating that the plane was too low to the ground, and then relayed that to the pilots.
01. To the left, I got to the menu. That's in the review. 3012.
Oh, I mean 3012 and 001.
And at 400 feet, they finally broke through the clouds. And at that point, they saw that they were too high and further right of where they needed to be. Captain Palia corrected the flight by pushing the nose down and to the left to get the plane to line up with the center line. And finally, after 15 hours of flying, the plane landed safely on runway 4 right at Newark. Emergency services then got in touch with the pilots to ask them whether they required any assistance, but the pilots declined. 10 minutes after they landed, as they were taxiing to the gate, the entire airport was engulfed by a thunderstorm. If the crew had delayed their approach by 5 minutes, or had to make a second go-around, they would never have been able to land. Unfortunately, the root cause of these numerous instrument failures remains unknown, as neither an incident report nor an investigation report has been released by Air India. However, a prevailing hypothesis suggests that the aircraft's main computer, which controls the flight deck, the diagnostic systems, and maintenance systems, malfunctioned, presenting inaccurate values to the pilots. Despite being a crew of 4 individuals who had not previously collaborated, the pilots demonstrated commendable crew resource management by effectively coordinating with each other and with air traffic control, ultimately ensuring a safe landing of the plane. The plane was flown back to India the next day as a ferry flight for relocation.